Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm your host, Shrikrishna Upadhyaya, and my co-host today is Suman Joshi. Today our guest is Tanima Kishore, a human rights lawyer and an advocate on record at the Supreme Court of India. Tanima works with Migration and Asylum Project, MAP, which is India's first dedicated law center for forced migration and displacement. At MAP, Tanima is heading the project on sexual and gender-based violence, which will be the theme that we will be talking about in the episode today. So welcome to All Things Policy, Tanima.
Hi, thanks Sriram. Thank you, Suman. Thanks a lot for having me today.
Tanima, could you begin by speaking a little bit about MAP, the organization that you're working for, and the project on sexual and gender-based violence, or SGBV in short, that you're heading? And maybe you could also tell us, why sexual violence and gender-based violence are different, but also, have certain overlaps, and what does dealing with it in a consolidated manner help us achieve?
Thank you so much, Sri. The organization I work for, Migration and Asylum Project, it's a Delhi-based organization. We're a law research center and we provide legal aid and legal assistance to migrant communities. So my program, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Program, is a legal aid program mostly. And the communities we work with are mostly migrant communities who are living in Delhi and who are mostly survivors or at-risk population of sexual and gender-based violence. We do regular legal aid desks in the communities, legal awareness sessions, run a helpline number for the survivors. And as you rightly said, like the issue of sexual violence and gender violence are different and overlapping at the same time. The issue of sexual and gender-based violence need to be tackled together, definitely. So, I can start with just differentiating between sex and gender to make things clear. Sex is the biological difference between people, and gender is a social construct. That's how society see people who are from different sexual orientations or who are from, who see themselves differently. So sex and gender are rooted differently in how we define it, and the violence that inflicted on people based on their sex or gender will obviously be different as well. So, but it needs to be tackled together because, as you rightly said, they do overlap. The way the criminal justice system defines these crimes is not different. We define rape, for example, as a penile-vaginal offense or an offense where any kind of bodily injury is done to sexual organs. And those things are overlapping, whether it's a sexual violence or a gender-based violence. So they need to be tackled and addressed together. They can't be differentiated when it comes to addressing them, but it's important to understand how they're different so that assistance can be provided differently to different survivors.
I just like to come in here. See, when we talk about sexual or gender-based violence, it is a difficult topic to handle. It is a difficult topic to address, even amongst non-migrant communities. Even amongst people like you and I. So I would imagine that the challenge is for a migrant community, people are that much more magnified because of certain laws that we have or certain rules that we need to follow for reporting, first of all, this kind of violence, right? So what is it that is actually the challenge? If you can lay it down in legal or specific rules, like differences there, and what are particular challenges you face, while you are trying to address these things.
Right. Yeah. So for migrant communities, I think the biggest challenge that comes up is lack of support structure. Right. So if they are in a new place, which is not their home, which doesn't have the support system, the community support system, which they might have back at home, is missing. So with any migrant community, I think that's the first challenge they face. It's a new institutional, framework that they have to deal with. Most often there are language barriers as well. most people coming in Delhi from different states don't have
Yeah.
fluency in Hindi. They might not be able to interact properly with the police, for example. So language barriers, lack of support system in general, not having, your family with you to
Mhm.
support you in prosecution. Those things are definitely some of the major challenges, in addition to, of course, financial
Yeah, I would
limitations that.
imagine that. Yeah, that would be the first thing. Your access is determined by the amount of economic clout you wield. And given that these people do not have any of it, I would imagine just
Right.
making that first step, it will be the greatest challenge. And that is where
Right.
organizations like yours come in, I would assume, right?
Right, that's right. That's right. Also, sometimes, the documentations they have might not be familiar to the stakeholders in Delhi, for example, or any other city they've migrated to. So they could be carrying, insurance cards or cards from their state, their home state, which might not be recognizable to the police or the hospitals here. That adds another challenge because they don't have familiar documentation or proofs to show their identity or claim services.
Okay. What are the particular stakeholders involved when, say, a woman goes to report a case?
Right. So multiple stakeholders are involved depending on what kind of offense it is and what kind of route the survivor chooses to take. So the police, of course, is going to be involved if it's an HGBV case. So starting with the police, then there are paralegal volunteers who might be involved from the legal service authority. There are lawyers who would be appointed from the legal aid cell if the person is not able to hire a private lawyer. Right, there are doctors. If it's a sexual violence case, there is a compulsory medical examination. So there are going to be doctors who will be conducting a medical examination, which is very crucial. So the sensitivity level of the doctors plays a huge role in that case. And then, of course, what happens in a lot of sexual violence cases, especially when it's intimate partner violence, domestic violence cases, is that before a woman goes to the police station, she would also try some, outside court
Mediation.
settlement issues. Yeah, she might approach a Mahila Panchayat. In Delhi, we have Mahila Panchayat. There are also Nari Adalats in other
Mhm.
states. So there are all these mediation proceedings that people try to attempt. So these are mostly run by NGOs and social workers and state commissions. So there again, all these stakeholders play a huge role in impacting a woman's psychological health, also in like how much she wants to pursue the case, how much she wants to compromise, how much she wants to fight further. Yeah, all these players play a huge role in the whole journey of survivor of an SGBV case. So it's very important that the people she interacts with are supportive, are sensitized, are aware about what rights are out there for her and what options she has out there. Yeah.
Thanks, Tanima. So I think this is a good time to sort of segue into the broader picture here and zoom out a little bit. So I think India recently underwent the Universal Periodic Review, which is United Nations led peer review procedure which states go through to check their human rights track record over, I think, everyone's 4.5 years, right? So
Mhm.
what was the picture there? So how did India perform this time? What happened as opposed to the previous set of recommendations which came, I would assume, 4 years back? Have they been implemented by India? And at this broader level, how is India performing today?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, this happened a couple of months back. This was the fourth time India was being reviewed by the Human Rights Council. And here, as you know, it's like all the UN members get a chance to review each other. So, it's a peer review process. And it's very interesting because everybody is able to, pinpoint others, shortcomings and human rights records. It's a very interesting process. So, about 100 states participate, 100 countries participate, I mean, in this process. And what stood out in India's review was that almost every other country pointed out the issue of crimes against women in India. And that was something which had been highlighted in the previous cycle as well. And, was a huge portion of the set of recommendations for India last year. And when we looked at the report that was submitted by CSOs prior to the review, most of the recommendations had not been complied with. Some were partly complied with, some had not been complied with. Very few had been complied with. And I'm only talking about the recommendations related to crimes against women now. So yeah, I mean, and issues like marital rape and not having a trafficking law, these things were, I think, emphasized by a lot of countries, representatives from a lot of countries. It kind of stood out in that way because this is an issue which is, India having a high crime rate against women is become such a, like everybody talks about it at all platforms. It's been such a prevalent issue. There are so many funds allocated to address this issue, and the funds keep going unutilized. It's a little shocking and appalling that we are not, paying enough attention to it. We are still not focusing our policies towards it, and it's not getting any better in the years that go by. We keep having so many new laws, new policies, but the numbers are not getting better when it comes to those rates. So being highlighted at a platform like UPR kind of reinforces the fact that we need to pay attention now. It's something which is being brought to our attention by all our, other countries around us. So yeah, I mean, I feel like it's high time that we do something about it and show some positive action towards it.
So the way I see it, there are two important stakeholders here, right? Broadly put, one is at the micro level, we have the survivor themselves, and at the
Hmm.
macro level, we have this entire institutional setup, which consists of your state, your ministries, the
Hmm. Hmm.
judiciary, the police, and all the other sort of macro stakeholders involved in this. But there is a disjunct between them, and I believe the work that you do is seeking to bridge this disjunct. And for that, I understand from your work, whatever I have gone through, is that you are working towards community solutions which will help survivors access this institutional setup. So, what exactly are community solutions? When you use that phrase, what do you mean? And secondly, how do you think community solutions can or have already been deployed to bridge the gap that I just spoke about?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, what we have realized during our work was that there was a huge, like there's a big problem of underreporting cases or lack of assistance in reporting cases because of just there not being enough access to the services that are available or not being enough awareness about the services that are available. And that's where the community based solutions come in. And these are solutions which include community members themselves. So you identify people who are, who can support the survivors reaching those support services. So people like paralegal volunteers. So Legal Service Authority, NALSA, has the scheme of paralegal volunteers where they train law students, public spirited people, people who just want to help out their community. So they have an extensive training program for paralegal volunteers. They get registered with legal service authorities, and their job is to interact and engage with the communities and provide first line of counseling and connect them to legal aid services. So what our program, our organization also does is that we identify community members who are fit to become paralegal volunteers, who are interested in becoming paralegal volunteers. Or we identify paralegal volunteers who are already registered with Legal Services Authority, and we provide further training to them in gender based violence counseling work. So the idea is to strengthen this pool of paralegal volunteers, which we find to be a very untapped resource in the whole scheme of things of criminal justice system, because they can be very instrumental in connecting the survivors to justice system in general, just coordinating things and connecting them and counseling them, proven to be extremely useful in that regard. So, paralegal volunteers is definitely one community based resource which can be tapped into. And they've been getting a lot of attention from courts lately. There have been Supreme Court judgments, High Court judgments, which have emphasized on training more paralegal volunteers, placing them in police stations, placing them in hospitals, one stop centers, where they can counsel the victims and, just support them in the whole process. So paralegal volunteers is definitely one such resource. Another being Asha Anganwadi workers, who are healthcare, community health workers. And these are women who have time and again proven their worth in the communities because, I mean, even throughout the pandemic, this was a workforce which did not stop working. They continued going in the communities. They continued reaching out to women for vaccinations, for births, registrations of children. So this is a workforce which has remained active throughout pandemic as well. And the reason I feel they can be extremely crucial in supporting survivors of sexual violence is because these are women who interact with women in slum areas, in all communities, especially communities of migrant workers, at a daily basis, right? They are familiar faces for those
Yeah, they're
communities.
drawn from their own community, I guess. If that
Correct.
makes it
Yeah.
easy.
So a lot of times drawn from their communities. So they have that comfort level with them, right? So they are able to share domestic violence cases with them with a lot of ease, which they wouldn't otherwise with other NGOs or with other stakeholders. So these are the women, if they are trained, if these Asha Anganwadi workers are also trained to provide some counseling, are aware about the options of survivors of sexual and gender based violence, can become very crucial in bridging that gap that we're talking about. Yeah. So yeah, so that's another resource. And then there are also like Mahila Panchayats, who I spoke about a few minutes back, who are mostly NGOs who are providing counseling. It's another question how impactful those Mahila Panchayat solutions are, considering they don't have really any enforcement power. But that is a step which most women, especially domestic violence survivors, do like to explore before they take help of formal institutions. So Mahila Panchayat is also a very crucial player there. And of course, just grassroots level CSOs and NGOs who are working in the community, again, drawn from the community, just like our Anganwadi workers. So they are also people who can, encourage community to support each other in reporting cases, or just become like watchdogs for the community in general, so that there is support available within the community. So yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one small point about the ASHA
Hmm.
workers. Yes, I mean, there's no doubt that they have stepped up like no other group
Hmm.
has
Hmm.
done through the pandemic. And
Hmm.
but at the end of the day, they are volunteers, and
Hmm.
they haven't even been paid as much as they were promised to be paid for the
Right.
regular work that they do. So to burden them with one more thing just seems a little unfair. But I get your larger point about since they're
So
already
yeah, no.
within
So
that
when I
phase.
talk about these, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the system hasn't treated them fairly at all. So when I talk about these solutions, the paralegal volunteers and Anganwadi workers, and training them to support survivors, there has to be a financial component to it. We cannot expect them to do this voluntarily. It has to be institutionalized. They have to be trained, and I feel they need to be integrated into the justice system for survivors of sexual violence. And of course, they have to be compensated fairly for it. Yeah, very rightly pointed out.
Thanks, Tanima. So at this point, let's take a short commercial break and we will return with more on community based approaches to dealing with the problem of sexual and gender based violence. Welcome back to All Things Policy. So, Tanima, when you spoke about the community based solution, you identified different stakeholders, paralegal volunteers, Asha Anganwadi workers, Mahila Panchayat, and volunteers from grassroots level NGOs, if I recollect correctly. So, my question to you is regarding the practicality of this, right? I mean, there needs to be incentive for each of these people to play the role of a bridge, to come back to that
Hmm.
metaphor, between survivors and institutional support structures. So, what are the incentives at play here? So, for paralegal volunteers, for example, under the scheme formulated by NALSA, do they get financial remuneration? Are there good enough career incentives in this regard? Are there many takers in your experience? And I think Asha Anganwadi workers, I think Suman has already pointed out the problem that exists. And for
Hmm.
Mahila Panchayats, even how does it play out in the sense, because whenever we go back to talking of panchayat solving social issues, there
Hmm.
is always a tension that they might take regressive stance. So is it any different,
Hmm.
or are they more progressive in dealing with these cases? And of course, even I'm sure the government, the Indian state, relies a lot on NGOs to do the last mile delivery in any
Hmm.
sort of public service delivery, right? So in
Right.
this regard, has the state or any state government been supportive of NGO volunteers mediating such cases in your instance? So a lot of questions, but feel free to kick in.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking these questions. So, yeah, you're right. incentivizing these resources and incentivizing these volunteers is, I think, the biggest challenge that everybody faces. That is why what I said just before the break, that they have to be integrated in the system. It has to be institutionalized at some level, because as you said, like, NGOs cannot be expected to take on the burden for bridging that gap. Even that gap has to be bridged institutionally. And I mean, NGOs are there and they are going to continue doing their part. But having these, I mean, ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, paralegal volunteers, these are already identified by the system. These are already institutional people who are, on, like, the list is maintained by authorities and institutions. So I think the only way to make it a sustainable bridge or a sustainable resource is if we channel our resources, the financial resources, and have schemes. Like, so there is already a paralegal volunteer scheme which lists out all their responsibilities, and that list keeps on increasing with court judgments assigning them responsibilities, and they are compensated for it. Even though it's not a lot, they are compensated on an hourly basis, half day basis, full day basis. If that payment is revised regularly, and if that is something which is publicized more, a lot of paralegal volunteers a lot of times don't even know about the schemes that are out there for them. So maybe publicizing it better, making it a little more lucrative. And as you said, like, also because a lot of them are law students, are young people, so also making it lucrative for them in terms of what it would offer them in future, having giving proper certification for the work they've done, so that they can use it further for their career growth. Field experience and interaction and engagement with CSOs is something which obviously helps any young lawyer. So I think that is something which can definitely be looked into, and it's already been looked into by different courts, as I said, like some very recent judgments which talk about paralegal volunteers. So paralegal volunteers is already an institutionalized thing, which I feel can has a lot of potential to grow further and become useful for the justice system. Become, it can really change things. I feel. And for Anganwadi workers and ASHA workers, as you rightly pointed out, like they've been protesting for really long now. They've been making very fair demands in terms of how they should be paid, how they should be compensated fairly for the efforts they put in. So it's high time that they are, formalized and get on a proper payroll from the ministries, concerned ministries. And of course, like, if we want to further train them and see them as people who can also support sexual and gender-based violence survivors, then that also would be an added responsibility. So if they have a formalized contract with the government with a proper pay structure, that obviously I think would be useful for everyone. So I guess that needs to be looked into for sure. So yeah, I mean, as you rightly said, like, these are solutions which can become sustainable and feasible only when we invest in them. And that is yet to happen, and I hope it happens. It has been in conversation now. So let's hope we see something positive in the coming times. Another thing you mentioned was about, I mean, Mahila Panchayat, as you said, that it's a tricky area to explore when it comes to especially things like domestic violence. But as I said, it's something which most survivors do want to explore, because nobody wants to go to the police or to court against their own family. So all those social stigma and taboo that that comes with it kicks in. So people try to resolve it at community level. Of course, the people who are heading Mahila Panchayats might have patriarchal mindsets themselves, right? There are a lot of pressures when they're going through that process. But again, like, a lot of our cases that we've worked with, it just feels like a necessary step they have to take before they jump to something more formal. So I mean, you can try to counsel them, but then again, I feel that is something which, the best you can do is to make sure. So, like, for example, in Delhi, all the Mahila Panchayats are run by Delhi Commission for Women, and they do regular trainings with them, right? So the idea there is to make sure that the people who are conducting these sessions are sensitized enough, are able to inform the women of her legal rights, and her options, so that she doesn't compromise more than she needs to or more than she wants to. So, and the whole process remains fair. But as you said, I mean, these things are tricky. They are not always as fair as you want them to be. But I do see it as like a necessary evil sort of a thing that remains hanging in
Right.
the whole framework. As
So
far
I'm
as
actually,
the sorry,
yeah.
yeah, also on the NGOs, so just a little bit about that. Yeah, again, like kind of covered it before, how the NGOs are going to continue, doing their part, but ultimate like sustainable solutions come from the government, because most NGOs will work, on funding basis, and fundings end, and donors change. So all those things impact your solutions. Like you can't provide very sustainable solutions for a problem this large, for a problem this prevalent, by something which is not as stable. So yeah, that can never be the solution, of course.
Sure. So one thing which I wanted to ask you is, could you take us through the journey of a case, right? Like if there is a survivor, I mean, the culmination would be the guilty being punished in the court of law. So, but that process, as we know, especially in the Indian judicial setup, is slow, it's tedious,
Mm.
and at times even harmful, and may not
Mhm.
bring about the justice that we expect in a situation. So could you take us through that process and maybe, contrast the two, right? The first being a survivor going through this process alone by herself with minimum family and friend support, and the
Mm.
second being a survivor passing through the same journey with the help of some community based resource that we have spoken about. So are those two contrasting journeys, how are they different?
Right. So, I mean, even I feel like, irrespective of how much support a woman has, it's actually her own battle. So, like, I've seen women with all possible support available to them, right? Even women from very privileged backgrounds, and, all possible resources at their disposal. But it's still an extremely difficult journey to undertake, and an extremely difficult process to maneuver. So it is ultimately, it boils down a lot to, the determination and the willingness of the person to take the case through. And we have seen women who come from absolutely no means, with no support system, show a lot more courage than somebody from an exact opposite background. So it's a very difficult question to answer as to the contrasting journey as to the support system available. But of course, like, more the support structure available, more women will, find that courage to take her case through. So it's the justice system itself has been designed to be victim friendly. There are a lot of laws and sections, within the criminal procedure code and all the other laws that we have, which take a victim centric approach. We have a lot of judgments, we have a lot of guidelines which support women through the journey, starting from the time she reports till the last step of sentencing. But when you see a real case, when you interact with a woman who's actually been through it, you won't see that reflecting so much in her journey. Okay, and that is where it all kind of, it becomes like a mirage. Because, I mean, just to give you an example, I recently was talking to somebody, and the person said that I don't think we need any more services for sexual and gender based violence women, because there's already so much. There's already so many support structures available. In fact, like, women get confused with support structure to choose from. So there's so many options available now. So much has already been done. And like, that really confused me, because it's true, there are so many support structures available, and yet there is nothing. Even now, when you go to a police station to report a case of rape or of trafficking or of domestic violence, you will be so hassled, no matter which background you come from, how no matter how educated you are. The first response at any police station is going to be that, either you are lying, or there would be, another solution for it. There can be some settlement that can be reached. You will start getting discouraged right from that stage. That's why, like, our advice to all our clients is to never go to a police station alone. Take somebody with you who will stand by you and keep, hold your hand through the process in pursuing the police officer to just file your case. Okay, so just getting the case registered itself is such a task. And then depending on the nature of the offense, the steps further, you have to go to the hospital for a medical examination. You have to go and record your statement before the magistrate. Then you have to identify the perpetrator. Then you have to go to court and give your evidence and repeat your story. So all these stages you have to constantly stick to your determination to continue it. You're constantly at all stages, all these people you interact with, be it the doctor or the magistrate or the police officers that you interact with, you would constantly feel as if you are inconveniencing them by pursuing this case. In fact, women are almost apologetic about pursuing their case. So it's a problematic system to navigate through, which becomes easier when you have somebody with you who knows the system more than you and who will be able to guide you, who will prepare you for what comes next, right?
So this is like a really bleak picture that you have painted for us. But I'm sure there are stories, there are, cases we have seen, which you have seen, who have made it through to the other side and, have achieved what they wanted to achieve with that. Would you, I mean, you don't have to reveal identities, but would you be able to take us through one of those or, anything that you think is noteworthy?
Yeah, and I mean, I would love to share some, success stories or like some stories where things made way for survivors. And of course, there are. I mean, the conviction rate in our country is not 0%. It's still less than 20%, but it's not 0%. So it's not I know it is a bleak picture for sure. But then, as I said, like community based solutions have been effective, at least in our experience. Like we have seen communities which were not who were new to the city, who had no idea about the laws that are available, especially for domestic violence cases. That is something which is so normalized that it's not even seen as a crime, even though it's a crime maybe worse than most. So we've seen, I mean, one of the cases which I can tell you about is a case of a woman where she was completely unaware about domestic violence even being a crime. It was so normalized in her mind.
Right.
And it was after these community health workers went and spoke to her and, pointed out it being a serious offense. And when she realized that there was a mechanism to get out of what she was going through, like it was just knowing one simple thing, that okay, this is something which I can get out of. And as soon as she found out, she immediately swung into action, moved out of the house, filed a domestic violence complaint, found herself a job, filed an application for maintenance against her husband. I mean, it was so quick, it was unbelievable. So she was somebody who was completely dependent on her husband, even though she was educated a little bit, and she was in a very, very abusive relationship. So she swung into action so quickly. I mean, her case is still going on. It's a pending case, so it's not something which has concluded. It's not like has a happy ending yet, but it depends on how you measure success, right? Like for her, I think
What
the
is
major
happy ending?
exactly. So in these things, you have to measure success and measure victories differently. The fact that she was able to get out of that abusive relationship has been life changing for her. So yeah.
Yeah, that's encouraging too. I mean, at least there's a silver
Yeah.
lining to everything that, every
Right.
dark cloud. So yeah, that's nice. Thank you.
So, Tanima, one final question, and this is sort of different from the issue of sexual violence and domestic violence that you've been speaking about. But nonetheless, this falls within the overall term sexual and gender based violence, which is of human trafficking, right? And I assume that is because most trafficking happens because either for sex work or labor, at least in our country. So,
Right.
what is your experience been with dealing with the issue of trafficking? And I also know that the government is planning to bring in a law which, other than the offenses in IPC already, which seeks to have a special law for dealing with human trafficking alone. And this was also one of the recommendations from the previous Universal Periodic Review, which we spoke about at the
Right.
beginning. So, is the picture going to change after that? And generally, as to what has been your experience in human trafficking?
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because it would be a game changer, but it definitely. So, thank you so much for asking this. It's an extremely important issue to discuss because human trafficking is one of the most, misunderstood and un, it's not talked about enough. It's not discussed enough. It's one of the most prevalent forms of sexual violence across the world, not just in our country, and it is an offense which needs to be addressed much more fiercely than we are. That is why that new law that you mentioned needs to be introduced. It was introduced back in 2018, the parliament, but it lapsed. It didn't get passed. So they would be reintroducing it now, I hope. I don't know if it would be a game changer, but it definitely would be a more comprehensive way to address it. Right now, what is missing in our trafficking legal framework is a comprehensive rehabilitation scheme for the survivors of trafficking, which is the most crucial part of a trafficking case. Not just trafficking, actually, I feel rehabilitation is something which is crucial for all sexual violence cases, but it's good to start with trafficking maybe. But then yeah, I mean, trafficking is an offense which is all around us. It's happening all around us all the time. We all have come across cases which give out signs of trafficking, but either we choose to ignore it or we are not informed enough to identify or understand it, right? But the prevalence of trafficking in India is very high. Conviction rates are extremely low. Girls and women of all ages are, sold into brothels, like very, very young girls, minor girls. There are all these myths and misconception about like virgin girls and all those things. So, like the younger the child is, the higher the price people pay for her. It's like that. Yeah. So that is something which is, our police force and our criminal justice system is just not equipped to deal with, equipped to, address. And it's a very serious offense. It's an organized offense. The people we end up targeting, even when they're identified, are very small players who are involved in trafficking. This is an organized offense. A lot of like big players are often involved in trafficking, which are not identified. That level of investigation, that in-depth investigation, is never conducted in trafficking cases. You usually end up arresting people you find at the crime scene, but those are usually not the real players in trafficking. Trafficking is not a small time offense. It's a continuing offense. It could be cross-border, it could be within the country. So it's something which is definitely, unaddressed and needs to be tackled at a war level, I feel, but it's not. So yeah, I mean, thank you for bringing up the issue of trafficking. I don't know how much time we have. I mean, trafficking is something you could have an entire episode of podcast on. So I would stop here.
Sure. Thanks a lot for that, Tanima. I think the primary takeaway, at least for me, from this conversation was navigating the Indian state is supremely difficult
Mm.
for any layperson and extremely so for a survivor because there is so much more trauma and inaccessibility
Mm.
involved there. At the same time, I believe community resources can play a critical role in helping survivors navigate this complex, big, often inaccessible, and supremely formal system, right? And they can play a role in sort of bridging the gap, the metaphor that we have used often today. So, thanks a lot for joining this conversation.
Thank you so much for talking about this issue. I'm glad we did this episode. Thanks a lot, Shri and Suman.
Thank you, Tanima. Thanks, Shri.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.